War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue our discussion of Israel and the occupied territories, we turn to the words of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Earlier this week, he discussed the impact of the 1967 war on the Palestinians.
Even in June, the Six-Day War went down in history as marking the defeat of the Arabs by Israel. Our standing up to this defeat, in spite of the hardships, could make up for what we have lost in war. Perhaps we can even erase it from memory with a great achievement: putting an end to the occupation of Palestinian and Arab lands, creating our independent state, recovering our Jerusalem, solving the refugee problem in a just and acceptable manner, based on legitimate international resolutions.
On Wednesday, Israel's Deputy Premier Shimon Peres claimed Israel did not intend to occupy the West Bank and Gaza in 1967.
The war that we were seeking, we were forced into it. We didn't intend to conquer any territories. That was a result of a forced war upon us. On many occasions we tried to negotiate and settle the burning issues, and I didn't lose my hope. We wouldn't like to see the Palestinians suffering. We wouldn't like to see the Palestinians occupied. We wouldn't like the Palestinians missing a chance of a flourishing and democratic economy. We are ready to negotiate straight away, fully, sincerely, and responsibly.
To talk more about the Six-Day War of 1967, we're joined by three guests. Tom Segev is an Israeli historian and columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. He's the author of the new book, 1967, Israel, the War, and the Year That Transformed the Middle East. The Palestinian doctor and human rights activist Mona El-Farra also joins us here in New York. Director of the Gaza Projects for Middle East Children's Alliance, writes the blog From Gaza with Love. She's just begun her first U.S. speaking tour. And Norman Finkelstein joins us in Chicago, where he's professor of political science at DePaul University. His latest book is Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Tom Segev, I'd like to begin with you. Go back 40 years. Tell us what happened this week 40 years ago.
It all began when Palestinian terrorists started to penetrate Israel through Syria, which caused tension along the Syrian border, that then spread to tension along the Egyptian border. Egypt made threats and threatening moves, and Israelis genuinely believed that they are facing a second Holocaust. They were very, very weak. The society was very weak. And so I think that war with Egypt at that time was inevitable for this reason, because Israelis were too weak not to strike at Egypt. But that was only one of the 3 weeks fought that week. There was also a war with Jordan and also a war with Syria. And I think that taking the West Bank and East Jerusalem contradicted Israel's national interest. And that is not something I'm saying in hindsight. This is something Israeli policy makers knew at the time. 6 months prior to the war, they had actually concluded that it will not be in Israel's interest to take the West Bank. Comes the day, June 5th, 1967, Jordan attacks West Jerusalem. All reason is forgotten. And they take East Jerusalem and the West Bank, in contrast to Israel's national interest, as defined by them 6 months previously. So it's a completely irrational thing. It's about religion, it's about emotion, it's about 2,000 years of longing for Zion. It's not about strategy, it's not about national interest.
The role of the United States and Britain at the time?
Britain was not that important. The United States tried to prevent the war. President Johnson actually was against military action. He, to the rest of his life, thought that the Six-Day War was a mistake. And Israel eventually did not go to war until we received a green light from the United States, a reluctant green light. The major problem for Johnson was the fear that the war wouldn't go so well, and Israel will turn to the United States and ask for military assistance, and that would get them involved in addition to the war in Vietnam already. But he was convinced that Israel can do it alone.
Abba Eban went to Washington.
Yes, Abba Eban went
to plead with Johnson.
That's right, that's right. And he had 2 meetings with him. But that was not when he got the green light. Actually, Johnson asked for postponement, and Israel agreed to postpone the war. It was only later when the head of the Israeli Mossad, Meir Amit, went and had talks with the CIA when the green light was actually given.
Norman Finkelstein, you too have written extensively about what happened in 1967. Can you describe events as you research them? We will continue with Tom Segev, and we'll link Norman Finkelstein up in just 1 minute. So then the war began. Explain what happened in those days.
The war with Egypt was won within hours, really. Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, and that was actually part of what led the Israeli government to decide to take the West Bank, because from a very, very great fear, they had moved very, very rapidly to great euphoria. And it was that euphoria that actually contributed to the decision to take the West Bank. East Jerusalem was taken, the West Bank was taken, and eventually the Golan was also taken. So by the end of the war, Israel controlled vast amounts of Arab land and a very large Palestinian population. The problem at the beginning was that the Palestinians did not resist. They came to work in Israel. Israelis went to the West Bank. Everything seemed as if it's possible, and no one tried to force Israel to give these territories back. And of course, once taken, East Jerusalem could not be given back because of political reasons and because of religious reasons. So it was a very harmful decision to take it in the first place, and the West Bank also.
Mona El-Farra, you're a physician in Gaza. Can you talk about what happened in Gaza for you, how you experienced 40 years ago? You were born in Gaza?
Yeah, I was born in Khan Yunis, in the south of Gaza Strip.
In Khan Yunis.
And during the war, I was only 13 years old, and it was sort of a shock for me. We stayed in the basement for about 5 or 6 days. And after that, after the war have ended, and I realized that there is Israeli, now I am face to face with the Israeli army, with the Israeli people. I did not see any Israeli before, so it was sort of shock for me, and all my life have changed because of the occupation. As a teenager, as a youth, later on I was in the demonstrations protesting against occupation, so I am surprised about what Tom just have said. The resistance to occupation started the first few months of the occupation. For me, I experienced it as a teenager in the school student, actually.
You were about, what, 13 at the time?
13, yes. 13, but just a few months later, it was sort of organizing demonstrations against the occupation, and I was part of this, and I considered this sort of resistance. So the resistance to occupation is there from the first few minutes, despite of the fact that laborers started to go to Israel, but it was sort of cheap laborers, and people want to continue with their life. It was sort of overwhelming incident for me, for all my upbringing and for all years of my future years, because at that time I decided to go to medical school because of what I have seen of during the war, the wounded people and the hospitals, and how the lack of medical facilities were there during the war. So I say again, resistance to occupation started the first few months of the occupation.
Tom Segev.
That's of course true. There were also leaflets, also strikes in Jerusalem, teacher strikes, lawyer strikes. That's of course right, but it wasn't strong enough, and it led to the Israeli illusion that everything is temporary and that we have all the time in the world and all we need to do is to wait. And that is what I mean, because we all remember the hijackings of the plane and other very spectacular terrorist acts by the Palestinians in the 1970s. So a few months is already a long time, because after a few months, until then, this illusion was already born, that there is such a thing as you know, the Israeli term was benevolent occupation, some Israeli invention, as if we can